They were told the Americans would peel the skin from their bones, that they would be violated, tortured, and thrown into the Pacific to drown. But when 247 Japanese women, prisoners of war, stepped onto American soil in September 1945, what they encountered was far more dangerous than any torture. They encountered kindness. And kindness, when you've been taught to expect monsters, is the cruelest weapon of all. If stories like this fascinate you, stories that reveal the uncomfortable truths hidden in history's shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about enemies, about war, and about the lies we tell ourselves to justify the unthinkable. The propaganda officer's voice still echoed in Coe's mind as the transport ship cut through the fog toward San Francisco Bay. She could see his face, twisted with righteous fury as he stood before the assembled women in Manila 3 months earlier. "American soldiers are beasts," he had said, spitting the words like venom. "They have no honor, no code, no humanity. If you are captured, they will strip you naked and parade you through their streets. They will use you and discard you like garbage. They will laugh while you beg for death." He had leaned forward, his eyes burning with conviction. Death is preferable to capture. Remember this. Death is mercy compared to what awaits you in American hands. Coe had believed every word. Why wouldn't she? He was an officer. He represented the emperor. He spoke for Japan. And Japan would never lie to its children. Now, standing on the deck of this American transport ship, her hands gripping the cold metal rail, Coe wondered if she would have the courage to die well. She was 22 years old. She had served as a nurse in field hospitals across the Pacific, had seen men die screaming, had held their hands as they called for their mothers. She thought she understood suffering. But this was different. This was the suffering of waiting, of knowing what was coming and being powerless to stop it. The fog was so thick she could barely see the woman standing next to her. Yuki, 24 years old, a radio operator who had intercepted American transmissions for 2 years. Yuki's face was gray, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't spoken in 3 days. "Do you think it will be quick?" Coe whispered. Yuki didn't answer. She just stared into the fog, her jaw clenched so tight Coe could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin. Around them, 245 other women stood in silent clusters. Some prayed, their lips moving soundlessly. Others wept quietly, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on their faces. A few stood frozen, their eyes empty, their minds already gone to some distant place where fear couldn't reach them. They had been at sea for 19 days. 19 days of rough water and poor rations. 19 days of sleeping in crowded holds that smelled of vomit and unwashed bodies. 19 days of wondering what fresh horror awaited them at journey's end. The ship's horn blasted, deep and mournful, and the women flinched as one. Through the fog, something massive began to emerge. Red towers rising impossibly high, cables stretching across the sky like the strings of some giant's instrument. The Golden Gate Bridge. Coe had seen photographs before the war, but photographs couldn't capture this. The scale of it. The audacity of it. In Japan, bridges were practical things, built low and functional. This was something else entirely. This was a bridge that declared to the world, we can build anything. We can do the impossible. We are untouchable. And they were. While Japan's cities had been reduced to ash, while its bridges lay twisted in rivers, while its people starved in the rubble, America had this. Perfect, pristine, untouched by war. "They didn't suffer at all," Yuki said suddenly, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Look at it, they didn't suffer at all." Coe understood what she meant. The bridge was proof. Proof that while Japan had bled and burned, America had remained whole. The war that had destroyed everything Coe knew had barely touched this place. The ship moved beneath the bridge and Coe tilted her head back, watching the red towers disappear into the fog above. For a moment, she forgot to be afraid. She forgot about the torture that awaited her. She could only stare at this impossible structure and feel something she hadn't felt in years. Awe. Then the moment passed, and fear crashed back over her like a wave. The pier came into view slowly, wooden planks stretching out into the bay, buildings beyond, white and clean and undamaged, and soldiers. Dozens of American soldiers standing in loose formations, waiting. The women pressed against the rail, staring down at their executioners. But something was wrong. The soldiers weren't in attack formation. They weren't pointing rifles at the ship. They weren't shouting threats or preparing weapons. They were just standing there, talking to each other, smoking cigarettes, laughing at something one of them had said. Laughing. "Why are they laughing?" Ko whispered. "It's a trick," Yuki said quickly, "to make us lower our guard, to make us compliant before—" She stopped. Neither of them wanted to finish that sentence. One of the soldiers looked up at the ship and waved. A casual, almost friendly gesture, as if he were greeting a neighbor, not enemy prisoners. Ko's mind couldn't process it. The propaganda officer had shown them photographs of American soldiers, their faces twisted with hatred and cruelty. These men looked nothing like those photographs. These men looked ordinary, young. Some of them couldn't have been more than 18 or 19 years old. The gangway lowered with a metallic clang that made every woman jump. American officers appeared at the top of the ramp, clipboards in hand, their uniforms crisp and clean. One of them, a Japanese-American soldier, stepped forward and spoke in perfect Japanese. "You will exit the ship in single file. You will be processed and given medical examinations. You will be assigned quarters. No harm will come to you. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention." Geneva Convention. Ko had never heard those words before. She looked at Yuki, who shook her head slightly. She didn't know either. "This is a trick," an older woman behind them hissed. "They're lying. They'll separate us and then—" "Silence," the translator said, not unkindly. "Please form a line and proceed down the gangway." No one moved. The women stood frozen, staring at the ramp as if it led to a guillotine. "Please," the translator said again. "The sooner we begin processing, the sooner you can rest." Rest. As if they were guests, not prisoners, as if they were travelers, not enemies. Finally, one woman stepped forward. Then another. Then Ko found her legs moving, carrying her toward the gangway even though her mind screamed at her to stop, to resist, to do anything but walk willingly toward her own destruction. Each step down the ramp felt like walking through water. The wood creaked beneath her feet. The fog swirled around her ankles. Below, the American soldiers watched, their expressions curious but not cruel. Ko's foot touched American soil. She waited for the blow, for the rough hands, for the violence she had been promised. Instead, the first soldier she passed smiled at her. Not a cruel smile. Not a mocking smile. Just a smile. The kind of smile you give to someone you pass on the street. Polite, neutral, human. Ko's legs nearly gave out. Yuki caught her arm, steadying her. "Keep walking," Yuki whispered. "Don't show weakness." They were herded into a large white building that smelled of something sharp and clean. Disinfectant, Ko realized. The smell of hospitals, the smell of medicine and sterility and care. Inside, American nurses waited. Women in crisp white uniforms, their hair pinned back, their faces calm and professional. They looked at the Japanese women with expressions that held no hatred, no disgust, just professional assessment. One nurse stepped forward and spoke in English. The translator repeated her words in Japanese. "You will remove your uniforms and place them in these bags. You will then proceed to medical examination and showers. Clean clothing will be provided." Remove their uniforms. Strip naked in front of strangers. Panic rippled through the group like electricity. In Japan, modesty was sacred. To be seen undressed by anyone outside your family was a shame worse than death. To be seen by enemies? I can't, someone whispered. I can't do this. You must, the translator said gently. It's for hygiene purposes, to check for disease and injury. The nurses are professionals. They will treat you with respect. Respect? That word again. As if it applied to them, as if they deserved it. Slowly, with trembling hands, the women began to undress. Some turned their backs, trying to hide themselves. Others moved quickly, as if speed could erase the humiliation. Ko unbuttoned her torn uniform with numb fingers, her face burning with shame. The American nurses moved among them with quiet efficiency. They didn't stare. They didn't comment. They simply handed each woman a white towel and pointed toward the next room. Ko clutched the towel to her chest and followed the line of women through a doorway. What she saw on the other side made her stop breathing. Showers, dozens of them. Shower heads lined the walls of a large tiled room, and steam, thick, warm steam filling the air like a dream. Please wash thoroughly, the translator said. Soap is provided. Take as much time as you need. Ko approached the nearest shower on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. On a small shelf beneath the shower head sat a bar of white soap. She picked it up with shaking hands. It was smooth, heavy, perfect. She lifted it to her nose and inhaled. Flowers. It smelled like flowers, like lilacs in spring. It's like her mother's garden before the war came and turned everything to ash. Ko turned the water on. Hot water poured over her. Not lukewarm, not cold. Hot. She gasped, her eyes flying wide. Hot water. She hadn't felt hot water in over a year. In the field hospitals, they'd been lucky to have any water at all. Most days, they'd washed with cold water from buckets, if they washed at all. Around her, other women were crying. Some laughed through their tears, the sound high and desperate. Others simply stood under the water, letting it run over their faces, washing away months of dirt and fear and exhaustion. Ko scrubbed her skin until it turned pink. She washed her hair 3 times, working the soap through tangles that had seemed permanent. The lather was thick and white, and the smell of flowers surrounded her like a memory of a world that no longer existed. She thought of her mother, of the garden in Osaka, of cherry blossoms in April and the way the petals would fall like snow, of a time before war, before propaganda, before she learned to fear the enemy more than death itself. When she finally turned off the water, her skin was clean for the first time in months. She felt lighter, as if she had washed away more than just dirt. The nurses handed out clean undergarments, simple gray dresses, and soft cotton socks. The dresses were plain but clean, and they fit reasonably well. Ko pulled hers on and caught sight of herself in a mirror on the wall. She barely recognized her own reflection. Clean. She looked clean. An older woman named Tomoko stood beside her, staring at her own reflection with wide eyes. "I forgot," Tomoko whispered. "I forgot I could look like this." But beneath the relief, beneath the unexpected comfort of clean skin and clean clothes, something darker stirred in Ko's chest. Confusion, shame, anger. They were supposed to be suffering. They were supposed to be tortured. The propaganda officer had promised them torture. Instead, they had been given hot water and soap that smelled like flowers. What kind of enemy does this to their prisoners? What kind of enemy treats you like a human being? And if the enemy treats you like a human, what does that make everything you were told? What does that make the war? What does that make your sacrifice? Ko followed the line of women out of the shower room, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers, questions that felt dangerous even to think. They were led into a mess hall that could have seated 300 people. Long tables stretched across the room, each covered with a clean white cloth. And the smell. Ko stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. Bread baking, meat cooking, coffee brewing, butter melting. The smell was so rich, so overwhelming, that several women couldn't move forward. They just stood there, breathing in the impossible scent of abundance. "Please take a seat," the translator said. "Lunch will be served." Ko sat at one of the long tables, her back rigid, her hands folded in her lap. Around her, the other women sat in silence, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. American soldiers in white kitchen uniforms appeared, carrying large trays. They moved down the rows, placing plates in front of each woman. Ko looked down at her plate and felt the world tilt beneath her. Roast chicken, golden and glistening. Mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy. Green beans, bright and fresh. A thick slice of white bread with a pat of yellow butter. A glass of cold milk. A cup of steaming coffee. She hadn't seen this much food on one plate in 3 years, maybe longer. Even before the war, even in peacetime, she had never eaten like this. Around her, no one moved. 247 women sat frozen, staring at their plates as if the food might vanish if they blinked. "Please eat," the translator said gently. "It's for you." Still, no one moved. They couldn't. Because if they ate this food, if they accepted this kindness, what did that make them? Traitors, collaborators, or just hungry women who had been lied to? Finally, Yuki picked up her fork. Her hand shook as she cut a small piece of chicken and lifted it to her mouth. She chewed slowly, her eyes closing. Then she started to cry. That broke the dam. Women all around Ko began to eat. Some slowly, carefully as if the food might be poisoned, others frantically as if it might be taken away at any moment. Ko bit into the bread. The soft texture made her gasp. For the last year of the war, she had eaten bread made from sawdust and tree bark. This bread was soft, white, perfect. She spread butter on it with trembling fingers and took another bite. The richness made her dizzy. Across the table, Tomoko was crying so hard she couldn't eat. She held a piece of chicken in her hand, staring at it, her whole body shaking with sobs. "My children," Tomoko whispered. "My children are starving in Tokyo, and I'm eating chicken." The guilt hit all of them at once, a wave of shame so powerful it was physical. While they sat here eating roast chicken and mashed potatoes, their families in Japan were picking through rubble for scraps. Their children were eating grass soup. Their parents were dying of starvation in the ruins of bombed cities. And here they were, prisoners of war, eating better than they had ever eaten as free citizens of the empire. Some women pushed their plates away, unable to continue. Others ate everything, driven by hunger so deep it overrode shame and guilt. Ko ate and cried at the same time, tears falling into her mashed potatoes, her body unable to choose between relief and anguish. The American soldiers watched from the edges of the room. One young soldier whispered to another, "They're crying. Should we do something?" "Just let them eat," an older soldier replied quietly. "They'll be okay." But would they? Ko wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. After the meal, they were led to their barracks. They walked in a daze, their bellies full for the first time in months, their minds struggling to process what was happening. The barracks were simple wooden buildings painted white. Inside, neat rows of beds lined the walls. Not mats on the floor, not piles of straw. Actual beds with metal frames, mattresses, pillows, and folded blankets. Ko chose a bed near the window and sat down slowly on the mattress. It was soft, not luxurious, but soft. She pressed her hand into it, feeling it give under her weight, then spring back. She hadn't slept on a mattress since leaving Japan 2 years ago. Beside her, Yuki was running her hand over the wool blanket, her expression distant. "It's thick," Yuki said softly. "Winter is coming, and they gave us thick blankets." At the end of the room, a small wood stove sat ready. The translator explained that it would be lit in the evenings to keep them warm. Tomoko sat on her bed and buried her face in her hands. "This is wrong," she whispered. "Everything about this is wrong. We're prisoners. We're supposed to suffer. We're supposed to pay for what our country did." She looked around the barracks at the beds, the blankets, the windows with curtains. Instead, they treat us like human beings. That night, as darkness fell and the lights were dimmed, Ko lay in her bed, wrapped in her warm blanket, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American military base. Trucks rumbling in the distance, soldiers calling to each other in English, the low hum of generators. Outside, crickets chirped. Somewhere, a radio played music, soft and jazzy and utterly foreign. Ko pulled her blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. Her body was warm. Her stomach was full. She was clean. She was safe. And she had never felt more confused in her entire life. She thought of the propaganda films she had seen in Japan, the ones that showed Americans as monsters with no souls, no honor, no mercy. She thought of the officers who had told her that surrender meant torture and death. She thought of everything she had believed about the enemy. And then she thought of the soldier who had smiled at her on the dock, the nurse who had handed her a towel with gentle efficiency, the chicken on her plate, the soap in her hands, the bed beneath her body. Everything she knew was a lie. And that realization was more terrifying than any battle she had ever witnessed. Because if they lied about the enemy, what else did they lie about? What else had she believed that wasn't true? Ko closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind raced in circles, chasing questions that had no answers. In the darkness, she heard other women crying softly. Some prayed to ancestors. Others whispered to each other, their voices filled with the same confusion and fear that gripped Ko's heart. They had survived the war. They had survived capture. They had survived the journey across the Pacific. But could they survive kindness from the enemy? Could they survive the truth? If you're finding this story as powerful as I am telling it, do me a favor. Hit that like button and drop a comment below. Let me know what you're thinking so far. Because what happens next will challenge everything these women thought they knew about loyalty, honor, and the lies we tell ourselves to justify war. The bell rang at 6:30 every morning, gentle and clear, like a temple bell from another life. Ko woke on her third day in the camp and lay still for a moment, listening to the sound echo across the barracks. It wasn't harsh or demanding. It was almost polite, as if asking rather than commanding them to wake. She sat up slowly, her body still adjusting to the softness of the mattress. Around her, other women were rising, making their beds with military precision. Old habits died hard, even in captivity. Breakfast was served at 7 situ, oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, scrambled eggs, fluffy and yellow, toast with strawberry jam, fresh oranges, their skin bright and perfect, coffee and milk. Every single morning, this abundance appeared on their tables as if by magic. Ko ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying not to think about her little brother in Tokyo, trying not to imagine his hollow cheeks and empty bowl, trying not to feel the guilt that sat in her stomach like a stone, growing heavier with each meal. After breakfast, work assignments were given. Ko had been assigned to the camp hospital, helping the nurses with basic tasks. The work was light, almost gentle, nothing like the brutal labor she had expected. She worked alongside 2 American nurses, Helen and Margaret. They were young, maybe a few years older than Ko, with kind faces and patient hands. They showed her how to fold bandages, how to organize supplies, how to sterilize equipment. They treated her not as an enemy or a prisoner, but as a colleague. Helen had started teaching her English words. "Bandage," she would say, holding up the white cloth. "Bandage." Ko would repeat it, her tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. "Bandage." Helen would smile and nod. "Good. Very good." It was such a small thing, this language lesson, but it felt enormous, because Helen was taking time to teach her, to help her, to treat her like someone worth investing in, Why would the enemy do that? The question haunted Ko as she worked. It haunted all of them. One afternoon, Ko was carrying a stack of folded linens down the hospital corridor when her foot caught on an uneven floorboard. She stumbled, and the linens exploded from her arms, white sheets scattering across the floor like snow. Ko dropped to her knees immediately, her face burning with shame. In Japan, such clumsiness would have earned her a sharp rebuke, maybe a slap. She scrambled to gather the sheets, her hands shaking, waiting for the anger. Instead, she heard laughter. Not cruel laughter, not mocking, but warm, gentle laughter. She looked up to see an American doctor, a young man with sandy hair and tired eyes, grinning at her as he knelt down to help. "Happens to everyone," he said in English, which she didn't understand, but his tone was clear. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even annoyed. Together, they gathered the sheets. When they were done, he handed her the stack and gave her a mock salute, still smiling. Then he walked away, whistling a tune she didn't recognize. Ko stood in the hallway for a full minute, holding the sheets, trying to understand what had just happened. An officer, an American officer, had knelt on the floor to help her, an enemy prisoner, pick up laundry, and then he had smiled at her. Who were these people? Yuki's transformation came through music. She was walking back from her work assignment in the camp laundry one afternoon when she heard it. Jazz, bright and brassy, pouring from an open window in one of the American barracks. She followed the sound and found a group of young soldiers gathered around a phonograph, listening to a record and laughing. One of them saw her standing outside and waved her closer. "You like music?" he asked through gestures, since neither spoke the other's language. Yuki nodded hesitantly. The soldier disappeared inside and returned a moment later with the record. He handed it to her. "Gift," he said, using one of the few Japanese words he knew. "Purezento." Yuki stared at the record in her hands. Glenn Miller and his orchestra. She tried to hand it back, shaking her head, but the soldier refused. "No, no. You keep. For the girls." That night, Yuki played the record in the barracks on the small phonograph that had been provided for their recreation. The music filled the room, bright and alive and utterly American. Some women frowned and turned away, unable to enjoy the music of their enemies. But others closed their eyes and swayed slightly, letting the rhythm wash over them. Yuki sat on her bed, watching them, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Music was music, regardless of where it came from. Beauty was beauty. Kindness was kindness, and the enemy was giving them all three. The most shocking part came on Fridays. Every Friday, each woman received a small envelope containing camp script, paper currency that could only be used within the camp. They were being paid for their labor as if they were workers, not prisoners. With this money, they could visit the camp canteen, a small store stocked with items that seemed impossible. Ko stood in front of the candy display on her first visit, her eyes wide. Chocolate bars, Hershey's, Nestlé, Baby Ruth, rows and rows of chocolate just sitting there, available for purchase. Back in Japan, chocolate had disappeared years ago, reserved only for the military elite. Here, enemy prisoners could buy it with their labor wages. There were cigarettes, lipstick, hand lotion, pencils and notebooks, small bottles of perfume, handkerchiefs with embroidered flowers. These weren't necessities. These were luxuries, things that made life more than mere survival. Yuki bought a chocolate bar. She carried it back to the barracks like a treasure, unwrapping it slowly, breaking off one square at a time. The sweetness melted on her tongue, and she closed her eyes, savoring it. "I'm eating chocolate," she whispered to Ko. "We're prisoners of war, and I'm eating chocolate." Ko bought a notebook and a pencil. That night she began to write. Not a diary, exactly. More like questions. Questions she couldn't ask out loud. Why are they kind to us? What do they gain from treating us like humans? If they are not monsters, what does that make the war? If they are not monsters, What does that make us? The routine continued day after day, wearing down their resistance more effectively than any torture could have. Breakfast at 7 isk, work assignments. Lunch at noon, always hot, always substantial. Dinner at 6 sak, with meat at nearly every meal. In between, there were breaks, rest periods, even time for recreation. The Americans had set up a small library in one of the buildings, stocked with Japanese books they had somehow acquired. The women could check out books, read in their free time, discuss stories with each other. On Sundays, there was no work. The women could rest, write letters, or attend religious services if they wished. A Buddhist chaplain visited once a month. Christian services were available every week. The Americans accommodated both. This routine, this strange, gentle, almost domestic routine, began to change them in ways they couldn't resist. Their bodies grew stronger. Color returned to their cheeks. They gained weight, their hollow faces filling out, their bones no longer pressing sharp against their skin. But with physical health came mental turmoil, because every day of comfort was also a day of guilt. Every meal was a reminder that their families were starving. Every bar of chocolate was a betrayal of everyone suffering back home. And yet they couldn't stop accepting it. They couldn't refuse the food, the warmth, the small kindnesses. They were trapped, not by barbed wire, but by the paradox of an enemy who treated them better than their own country ever had. The letters from home arrived slowly, sometimes taking weeks to reach the camp. They came in thin envelopes, the paper worn and fragile, the handwriting shaky and desperate. Ko's first letter from her mother arrived in late October. She sat on her bed in the evening light and opened it with trembling hands. My dear Ko, we received word that you are alive and a prisoner in America. This brings me both relief and sorrow. Relief that you live. Sorrow for what you must endure. Tokyo is gone. Our house is rubble. Your father and I live in a shelter made from sheets of metal. We eat once a day, if we are lucky. Today we had rice water and a few leaves of cabbage. Your little brother grows thinner each week. He asks about you constantly. He remembers you bringing him sweets before the war. There are no sweets now. There is hardly anything. But we are alive, and that is enough. I hope you are being treated fairly. I hope you are not suffering too much. We pray for you every night. Your loving Mother Ko read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking harder with each reading. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her trunk. That night, she couldn't eat dinner. She stared at the roast beef and carrots on her plate and saw her little brother's thin face. She pushed the plate away and went back to the barracks. She wasn't alone. All around her, women were receiving similar letters. Letters describing starvation, homelessness, desperation. One woman's husband had died of malnutrition. Another's parents had been killed when their neighborhood was firebombed. A third received word that her children had been sent to live with relatives in the countryside because there was no food in the cities. The contrast became unbearable. Here in California, the camp was surrounded by abundance. Beyond the fences, American towns bustled with life. Stores were open and full of goods. Children played in parks. Families drove cars down clean streets lined with houses that had never been bombed. The women could see it when they were taken outside the camp for work details. Life continuing, normal and untouched, as if the war had happened on another planet. Yuki worked in a vegetable field one day, harvesting carrots alongside other prisoners. At lunchtime, the American guard supervising them opened his metal lunchbox and began sharing his sandwiches with the women. He did this casually, as if it were nothing. Ham and cheese on white bread, wrapped in waxed paper. He handed out sandwiches like a man feeding birds in a park. "My wife makes extra," he explained through the translator. "She knows you girls are hungry." His wife, a woman Yuki had never met. A woman whose country had been at war with hers, had made sandwiches for enemy prisoners because she thought they might be hungry. Yuki took the sandwich with both hands, bowing deeply, tears streaming down her face. That night, she wrote in her journal, "The guard's wife sent sandwiches. She doesn't know us. We were her enemies. Her country fought ours, and people died because of that. But she sent sandwiches. How am I supposed to hate people like this? How am I supposed to remain loyal to an empire that let me starve while the enemy feeds me?" The physical transformation was impossible to hide. The women looked healthier than they had in years. Their skin glowed. Their hair shone. They had flesh on their bones again. When they caught their reflections in windows or mirrors, they hardly recognized themselves. Tomoko stood in front of a mirror in the washroom one morning, staring at her own face. "I look like I did before the war," she whispered. "I look healthy. I look fed." She touched her cheek, feeling the softness there, the absence of sharp bone. Then she thought of her children's gaunt faces in the last photograph she had received, and she turned away from the mirror, unable to look at herself anymore. The guilt was crushing. To be well fed while your family starved, to sleep in a warm bed while your parents lived in rubble, to eat chocolate while your children foraged for grass to boil in water. This was a torture more sophisticated than any beating. This was the torture of being shown mercy when you believed you deserved punishment, of being treated with dignity when you expected cruelty, of discovering that everything you had been taught about honor, sacrifice, and enemies was a lie, and the lie cut deeper than any blade. The first cold snap hit California in November. The women woke one morning to frost on the windows and their breath visible in the air. They huddled under their blankets, dreading the cold that they knew would seep into their bones. But at breakfast, the American commander made an announcement through the translator. "We've ordered additional blankets and warm coats for all prisoners. They should arrive by next week. In the meantime, we've increased the coal for your stoves. Stay warm." That was all. No fanfare. No expectation of gratitude, just a simple statement that they had noticed the cold and were taking care of it. Tomoko sat at breakfast with tears streaming down her face. "They notice when we're cold," she whispered to the women around her. "The enemy notices when we're cold and brings us blankets." She thought of the winter her family had spent in Hiroshima 2 years earlier, before the bomb, when they had burned furniture to stay warm because the military had requisitioned all the coal. She thought of her children's blue lips and shivering bodies. She thought of how her own government had looked at its citizens and seen nothing but resources to be used and discarded. And here was the enemy bringing blankets because prisoners might be cold. By December, the internal war raging within each woman had become more brutal than any external battle they had witnessed. Ko lay awake most nights, staring at the dark ceiling of the barracks, her mind spinning in circles that never reached a conclusion. She pulled out her mother's letters and read them by flashlight under her blanket. The words never changed, but they cut deeper each time. Hunger, cold, desperation, her little brother growing weaker. And here she was, gaining weight, learning English, being called a natural by an American nurse. The guilt was physical. It sat in her chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. Every bite of food she took felt like a betrayal. Every warm night in her bed felt like a crime. She was living better than she ever had in Japan, better than most Japanese civilians had lived even before the war, and she was doing it in enemy captivity. What did that make her? A survivor? A traitor? Both? Neither? The debates started quietly, in whispers after lights out. But as weeks passed, they grew louder, more heated, more desperate. "We are still Japanese," insisted Fumiko, a former translator who refused to learn English, refused to smile at the Americans. "Nothing they do changes who we are. They feed us because the Geneva Convention requires it, not because they care. When we return to Japan, we will be judged by how we maintained our dignity in captivity." "What dignity?" Yuki shot back, her voice sharp. "We were sent to war by men who promised us victory and glory. They gave us neither. They gave us starvation and defeat. And now the enemy feeds us, clothes us, treats us like human beings, and we're supposed to feel ashamed of that? I'm done being ashamed." "You're being brainwashed," Fumiko snapped. "This is exactly what they want, to make us forget who we are." "Maybe they are better than us," said Sachiko, the young clerk. "Not better, but different. I was taught that Americans had no honor, but I've seen more respect here than I ever saw in the Imperial Army. I watched officers beat soldiers for minor infractions. Here, I see soldiers who joke with each other, who treat their officers like human beings. That's not weakness. That's something else." "It's democracy," Tomoko said softly. "I read about it before the war, in books that were later banned. The idea that people can question authority. I thought it was a fantasy. But watching these Americans, I think maybe it's real." "Democracy didn't stop them from dropping atomic bombs on our cities," Fumiko countered coldly. "Don't romanticize them just because they're nice to us now." Silence fell over the barracks because Fumiko was right. The same country that gave them chocolate and blankets had also unleashed destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. How could both things be true? "Maybe," Yuki said slowly. "That's what makes them powerful. They can do both. They can destroy their enemies completely and then treat them with mercy afterward. That's not weakness. That's strength, terrifying strength." The turning point came in late December when the camp organized a Christmas celebration. The women watched in fascination as the Americans decorated a large tree in the recreation hall with lights, ornaments, and a star on top. They had never seen anything like it. The commander announced that the prisoners were invited to attend the Christmas party. There would be special food, music, and gifts. Gifts for prisoners of war. Most of the women attended out of curiosity. They sat in rows of chairs watching as American soldiers performed songs and skits. Some of the entertainment was clearly meant to be funny, though the humor didn't always translate. But the Americans were trying. They were putting on a show for their prisoners, trying to give them joy. Then came the gifts. Each woman received a small wrapped package. Ko opened hers with trembling hands and found inside a bar of soap, a comb, a small mirror, and a chocolate bar. Simple things. Practical things, but wrapped in bright paper with a ribbon, as if they were precious. She stared at the gifts in her lap and felt something break inside her. Not break in a painful way, but break open, like a seed cracking to let new growth emerge. These weren't lavish gifts. They weren't trying to buy her loyalty or gratitude. They were just human. One human giving another human something small and kind because it was Christmas. That's when Ko understood. The Americans weren't treating them well because of some calculated political strategy. They weren't following the Geneva Convention out of fear or obligation. They were doing it because this was simply how they treated people, even enemies, even prisoners, even Japanese women they had been at war with weeks earlier. This was the dangerous truth. American power came not just from bombs and bullets, but from the idea that every person had value, that even your enemy deserved basic dignity. That victory didn't require cruelty. This was the ideology they had been fighting against, the idea that individuals mattered more than the collective. That human rights existed regardless of nationality or loyalty, and it worked. It was working on them right now. Every meal, every blanket, every small kindness was a demonstration of this philosophy. "You could destroy us with your armies," these actions said, "but we'll rebuild you with our mercy. We'll show you that there's a better way." Yuki sat beside Ko, holding her own wrapped gifts, tears streaming down her face. "It's not a weapon," she whispered. "It's just who they are. That's what makes it so devastating." Around them, other women were crying too. Not sad tears, but something more complicated. Tears of release, tears of recognition, tears of grieving for the beliefs they had held and the sacrifices they had made for those beliefs. Tomoko stood up, walked to the front of the room, and bowed deeply to the American commander. The room fell silent. Through the translator, she said, "Thank you for treating us like human beings. We didn't expect this. We were taught to expect cruelty. But you have shown us something different. Something we don't fully understand yet, but we are grateful." The commander looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, his face slightly red. "We're just following the rules, ma'am," he said. "Geneva Convention requires proper treatment of POWs. We're not doing anything special." But they were. They absolutely were. Because following rules that protected even your enemies, treating prisoners with dignity even when your own people had died at their hands, choosing mercy when you could choose vengeance, that was everything. That was the whole point. As the party continued, something shifted in the barracks. The hardliners became fewer. The debates became quieter. A collective exhaustion settled over the women, the exhaustion of resistance finally crumbling. They couldn't maintain their hatred in the face of this relentless humanity. They couldn't cling to propaganda that called Americans demons when those demons were giving them Christmas presents. They couldn't remain loyal to an empire that had abandoned them when the enemy was the only thing keeping them alive. The transformation wasn't complete. It would take years, maybe decades, for some women to fully process what had happened to them. But in that moment, in that decorated hall with a Christmas tree and wrapped gifts and American soldiers singing carols, something fundamental changed. They began to see their captors not as the enemy, but as people. Flawed people, certainly. People capable of terrible things. Definitely. But people nonetheless. And in seeing that, they began to question everything else they had been taught. The most dangerous weapon America possessed wasn't the atomic bomb. It was the simple radical idea that human dignity transcended national boundaries. And that weapon was working exactly as designed. The mirror moment came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in January 1946. Ko was working in the hospital, organizing medical supplies in a storage room, when she caught sight of her reflection in a glass cabinet door. She stopped moving, stared, didn't recognize herself at first. The woman in the reflection had round cheeks, clear skin, bright eyes, healthy hair that shone even in the dim storage room light. She looked young again, alive. The hollow, haunted look that had defined her face for the last 2 years of war was completely gone. She looked like she had before the war. No, she looked better than she had before the war. Because even in peacetime Japan, she had never eaten this well, never had access to this level of medical care, never been this healthy. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her to herself. Ko's hands began to shake. She braced herself against the cabinet, her breath coming in short gasps. Because in that moment, seeing her own healthy reflection, the full weight of the betrayal crashed over her. Not betrayal by the Americans, betrayal by her own country. Japan had taken her youth, her health, her innocence, and used them as fuel for a war machine. Japan had fed her propaganda instead of food, had given her ideology instead of medicine, had demanded her sacrifice while offering nothing in return. Japan had told her that suffering was noble, that hunger was honorable, that dying for the emperor was the highest calling. All lies, all of it lies. Because here she stood, a prisoner of war, healthier and happier than she had ever been as a free citizen of the empire. The Americans hadn't broken her with cruelty. They had broken her with the truth that she was worth feeding, worth caring for, worth treating like a human being, and that truth demolished everything she thought she knew about loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. She slid down to the floor, her back against the cabinet, and sobbed. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal and wounded. She cried for the girl she had been, who had believed the propaganda. She cried for the years she had wasted serving a cause that had never valued her. She cried for her family still suffering in Japan, still trapped in the lie. She cried for all the people who had died believing that their sacrifice meant something, when really they had just been fuel for men who didn't care about them at all. Nurse Helen found her there 10 minutes later. The American woman took one look at Co's face and understood, somehow, without words. She sat down on the floor beside her, not touching her, not trying to fix it, just sitting with her in her grief. "It's okay," Helen said softly, even though Co barely understood English. "It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel betrayed. You were lied to. You have every right to grieve for that." Co looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. This woman, this American woman who had every reason to hate her, whose country had been at war with hers, who had probably lost friends or family to Japanese bullets, was sitting on a hospital floor offering comfort to an enemy prisoner who was having a breakdown. And in that moment, Co's worldview didn't just crack. It shattered completely. She understood now. This was what democracy looked like. This was what it meant to believe that every individual had inherent worth, regardless of which side of a war they were on. This was the philosophy that Japan had been fighting against. The idea that human rights weren't granted by emperors or earned through sacrifice, but simply existed because humans existed. Japan had lost the war, but more than that, Japan's entire ideology had been proven hollow. She thought of her little brother in Tokyo, starving. She thought of the American soldier yesterday who had shared his lunch with her. She thought of the emperor in his palace, untouched by the suffering of his people. She thought of the American commander ordering extra blankets for cold prisoners. The comparison was devastating and undeniable. That evening, Co stood in the barracks and spoke to the assembled women. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I saw myself in a mirror today," she said. "I looked healthy, and I realized that I look better now, as a prisoner, than I ever did as a free citizen of Japan. And that's not because America is perfect. It's because Japan failed us. Completely and utterly failed us." She looked around the room at faces both sympathetic and resistant. "I'm not saying we should forget who we are. I'm not saying we should become American. But I am saying that we need to acknowledge the truth. We were lied to about the war, about the enemy, about what our country was fighting for. And until we acknowledge that, we can't move forward." Silence filled the barracks. Then, slowly, one by one, women began to nod. Some cried, some looked away, but most nodded, because they had all seen themselves in mirrors. They had all felt the cognitive dissonance of being healthier in captivity than in freedom. They had all wrestled with the same devastating realization. The enemy had treated them like human beings, and in doing so had revealed that their own country never had. Fumiko stood up, her face hard. "You're a traitor, Ko. You've let them brainwash you. When we return to Japan, you'll be judged for this." "Then judge me," Ko said quietly, "but it won't change the truth. Look at yourself, Fumiko. Look at all of us. We're healthy, we're fed, we're warm, and our families are dying in rubble. If acknowledging that makes me a traitor, then I'm a traitor. But at least I'm not a liar." Fumiko's face crumpled. She sat down heavily on her bed and buried her face in her hands, because she knew Ko was right. They all knew. That was the moment everything changed. Not gradually, but suddenly, like a dam breaking. The resistance, the denial, the desperate clinging to old beliefs, all of it washed away in a flood of painful, liberating truth. They were still Japanese. They would always be Japanese. But they would never again be the women who had believed blindly, who had trusted without question, who had thought that suffering for the state was noble. They had been transformed, and there was no going back. As winter turned to spring, rumors of repatriation began to circulate through the camp. Ships were being prepared. Arrangements were being made. Soon the women would be sent back to Japan. The news should have brought joy. They were going home, back to their families, their country, their culture, but instead of joy, the women felt dread. Ko lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her stomach twisted in knots. What would she find when she returned? Her mother's letters painted a picture of utter devastation. Tokyo was rubble. Food was scarce. Disease was rampant, and she would return to it healthy, well-fed, with flesh on her bones and color in her cheeks. How would she explain that to her starving family? How would she look her little brother in his hollow eyes and tell him that she had been eating roast chicken while he foraged for weeds? "I'm afraid," Yuki confessed one evening as they sat on their beds. "I'm afraid to go back. What kind of person does that make me? Japan is my home. My family is there. But the thought of leaving here—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Do you feel guilty?" Tomoko finished for her. "Because this camp, this prison, has been kinder to us than our own country ever was. And that's not something we can say out loud without sounding like traitors. But it's true." "It's true," Sachiko said quietly. "I've been trying not to think about it, but it's true. I don't want to go back to starvation. I don't want to go back to a country that sees women as nothing but tools. I don't want to go back to being told that my worth is measured only by my service to the state." The conversations continued, always in whispers, always tinged with shame, because what they were admitting was unspeakable. They had come to prefer captivity in America to freedom in Japan, not because they loved America or had abandoned their identity, but because basic human needs, food, shelter, dignity, mattered more than abstract concepts of loyalty and patriotism. Some women began to ask the American officers if they could stay, if there was any way to remain in America rather than return to Japan. The answers were always the same: no. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. They had to go back, but the asking itself revealed how much had changed. These women, who had been taught that death was preferable to dishonor, were now begging to stay with their former enemies rather than return to their homeland. The ships departed in April 1946. The women stood on deck, watching San Francisco Bay disappear behind them, the Golden Gate Bridge shrinking on the horizon. Many cried. Some waved goodbye to the American guards on the pier who had come to see them off. Ko stood at the rail, her hand pressed against her chest, feeling her heart break in a way she hadn't expected. She was leaving behind the place where she had been treated with more dignity than she had ever known. The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks. The conditions weren't as comfortable as the camp. The ships were crowded, the seas rough, but they were fed regularly and treated with basic dignity. When the Japanese coast finally appeared on the horizon, the women crowded the rails, straining to see their homeland. What they saw made their hearts sink. Devastation. Complete and utter devastation. Cities reduced to ash. Harbors filled with half-sunken ships. Coastlines scarred by bombing. As they sailed past Hiroshima, the extent of the atomic bomb's damage became visible. An entire city simply gone. Flattened. Erased. They docked at Yokohama, and the reality hit them with full force. Skeletal buildings, rubble-lined streets, people in rags picking through debris, children with distended bellies and hollow eyes begging for food, women selling anything they had, clothing, family heirlooms, themselves, just to survive. This was what they were returning to. This was home. Ko stepped off the ship onto Japanese soil and felt no joy, only a crushing sadness. Around her, other women were crying, not with happiness, but with horror at what their country had become. They were processed through a repatriation center, given minimal supplies, and released to find their own way to their families. Ko boarded a train to Tokyo, watching the destroyed landscape roll past the windows. Burned forests, collapsed bridges, ghost towns where bustling cities had been. She found her family in a makeshift shelter in what had once been a prosperous neighborhood. Her mother had aged 20 years. Her father was sick with tuberculosis. Her little brother, now 12, was so thin she hardly recognized him. When they saw her, healthy, round-faced, clearly well-fed, their first expressions were joy. But the joy quickly turned to confusion, then to something else, something that looked like accusation. "You look well," her mother said carefully. "The Americans treated you well." Ko nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face, because she understood what her mother wasn't saying. "You were eating while we starved. You were safe while we suffered. You were with the enemy while we lost everything." The guilt she had felt in the camp was nothing compared to what she felt now. Years passed. Japan rebuilt itself, slowly transforming from ruins into an economic powerhouse. The occupation ended. Democracy took root, awkwardly at first, then more firmly. The women who had been prisoners in America scattered across the country, rebuilding their lives, rarely speaking of their experiences. But they were changed. Fundamentally, irrevocably changed. Ko became a nurse inspired by her time working in the American camp hospital. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to healing. In the 1960s, she opened a small clinic in Tokyo, treating patients with the philosophy she had learned in captivity, that every person, regardless of status or background, deserved dignity and care. She kept her American nursing textbooks, the ones Nurse Helen had given her as a parting gift. Sometimes, when the clinic was quiet, she would flip through them and remember the woman who had sat with her on a hospital floor while she cried. Yuki married an American soldier during the occupation and moved to California. It caused a scandal in her family, but she didn't care. She had seen enough to know that love and kindness mattered more than national pride. She raised 3 children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with chopsticks and forks, teaching them that identity didn't have to be singular or pure. Tomoko returned to her children and spent the rest of her life trying to explain to them what she had learned, that propaganda was dangerous, that questioning authority was not only acceptable but necessary, that their worth as human beings didn't come from service to the state but from their inherent humanity. Most of the women never spoke publicly about their time as prisoners. The shame was too deep, the contradictions too painful. But privately, in conversations with their daughters and granddaughters, they passed on what they had learned. They taught the next generation to question, to think critically, to recognize propaganda when they saw it. They taught them that the enemy isn't always who you're told it is, and sometimes, the people who treat you with the most humanity are the ones you least expect. In her final years, Ko told her niece about her time in the American camp. The young woman, born decades after the war ended, listened with wide eyes. "So, the Americans were good to you?" she asked. Ko shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. They dropped atomic bombs on our cities. They killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They were capable of terrible things." She paused, looking out the window at modern Tokyo, all glass and steel and prosperity. But they were also capable of mercy, of treating their enemies with dignity, and that mercy changed me more than any punishment could have. It made me question everything, and those questions led me to truth. Painful truth, but truth nonetheless. She smiled sadly. "I spent my whole life trying to pass on what I learned, that your enemy might treat you better than your own people, that propaganda is always a lie, no matter who's speaking it, that human dignity transcends borders and nationalism. These lessons cost me everything I once believed, but they gave me something more valuable, the ability to see clearly." Her niece was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "Do you think it was worth it? The pain of learning the truth?" Ko looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and understood even more. "The truth is always worth it," she said, "even when it destroys you, especially when it destroys you. Because what it destroys are the lies, and once the lies are gone, you can finally build something real. That is the story worth remembering. Not just a story of war and captivity, but a story of the most dangerous weapon ever deployed, the simple belief that every human life has value, even enemy lives, even the lives of those who fought against you. For those 247 Japanese women prisoners, The taste of chocolate and the smell of soap became proof that everything they had been taught was a lie, that the enemy could show mercy, that dignity was more powerful than cruelty, that sometimes the hardest thing to carry isn't hatred, but kindness from those you expected to hate you. These women discovered that the real battlefield wasn't between nations, but between ideologies, one that saw humans as tools and one that saw them as individuals worth protecting, even when they were your enemies. The propaganda had said that Americans would break them, and in a way, the propaganda was right. But the breaking didn't come through violence. It came through something far more powerful, the demonstration that there was a better way to live, that human dignity wasn't earned through sacrifice or granted by emperors, but simply existed because humans existed. And that truth, once seen, could never be unseen. If this story moved you the way it moved me in researching and telling it, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. History is full of uncomfortable truths like this one, stories that challenge what we think we know about enemies and allies, about war and peace, about who the real monsters are. These stories matter. They remind us that humanity can exist even in the darkest times, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is simple kindness. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment telling us what you think, and remember, the past has lessons for us, if we're brave enough to listen.